Assalamu alaikum. It's me, Samreen Baloch, and I'm from BBA 3. And today my presentation topic is diplomacy. So, first of all, what is diplomacy? The term diplomacy is derived via French from the ancient Greek diploma, composed of diplo meaning folded into and the suffix ma meaning an object. So now its definition is it is the process of negotiations between and among states that seeks to resolve conflicts without resorting to war. Or there is another definition of diplomacy. Uh, Diplomacy is a subset of international relations that is typically focused more narrowly around the process of conducting negotiations between representatives of different nations, or in some cases corporations from all different countries. So, according to Sir Ernest Mason, diplomacy is the application of intelligence that erect to conduct official relations between the government of independent states. And there is quote of Will Durant that to say nothing, especially when speaking, is half the art of diplomacy. Now, qualities of diplomats. The qualities that a diplomat should possess may be summed up as follows. As here, the word diplomacy, it has its qualities in this, like D, diligence and discretion, I, intuition and intelligence, P, perseverance, polish and punctuality, L, language, proficiency, O, observation powers, M, mannerly, A, adaptability and acumen, and T, tenacity or and tact. Now, types of diplomacy. There are many types of diplomacy. So here first one is summit diplomacy. Summit diplomacy is a type of conference diplomacy used by international governments in which the heads of states meet for face-to-face negotiations. And in 1950, Winston Churchill was the first person to describe a meeting of leaders of major power countries summit. Technology fastened the pace of diplomacy. After 1930, heads of the states started to telephone to other heads of the states. Now, public diplomacy. It deals with the influence of public attitudes and on the formation and execution of foreign policies, and diplomatic engagement with people, winning hearts and minds, building relations. And we also call it people's diplomacy. And here is its definition that it deals with the influence of public attitudes on the formation and execution of foreign policies. And basically its meaning is to communication with foreign public to establish a dialogue designed to inform and influence. Here is one example of this, that during the Cold War, the United States used public diplomacy to persuade European audience that the foundations of democratic government and capitalist enterprise were superior to Soviet alternatives. Now, secret diplomacy. Secret diplomacy means diplomacy carried by kings, presidents, and other rulers without the knowledge or consent of the people and behind closed doors. So here is example of this, like a head of President Trump meeting with other president, or meeting with Prime Minister Imran Khan. Now, trade to diplomacy. It is the practice of non-governmental, informal, and unofficial contacts and activities between private citizens or groups of individuals, sometimes called non-state actors. It contrasts with track 1 diplomacy, which is officially governmental diplomacy that occur inside official government channels. However, track 2 diplomacy is not a substitute for track 1 diplomacy. Rather, it is there to assist official actors to manage and resolve conflicts by exploring possible solutions derived from the public view and without the requirements of formal negotiations or bargaining for advantage. Now, economic diplomacy. Diplomacy includes building international coalitions to help countries recover from financial crisis, and it entails convincing host government leaders to apply the policies and their economics and provide jobs for their people, even if the reforms have political cost. There is example of economic diplomacy that China's growing international clout and its aggressive economic diplomacy is one example that highlights the urgent need for effective multi-pronged economic statecraft by the United States. Now, gunboat, or it is also called coercive diplomacy. So, gunboat diplomacy refers to the pursuit of foreign policy objectives with the aid of conspicuous displays of naval power, implying or constituting a direct threat of welfare. Warfare should terms not be agreeable to the superior force. And why gunboat diplomacy is actually important. Between 1905 and 1907, gunboat diplomacy ensured US financial supervision and control in that nation, while avoiding, at least initially, both the cost and the enmity that went with the establishment of a formal colony. US President James Monroe was first among 19th century leaders to legitimize gunboat diplomacy. In his now famous 1823 message to Congress, he warned all nations of the world that any armed intervention against offshore Latin American republics would be looked upon as a hostile action. Now, atomic diplomacy. Atomic diplomacy refers to attempts to use the threat of nuclear warfare to achieve diplomatic goals. After the first successful test of the atomic bomb in 1945, US officials immediately considered the potential non-military benefits that could be derived from the American nuclear monopoly. For example, in 1962, the Soviet deployment of nuclear missiles to Cuba in order to try to force US concessions on Europe became example of atomic diplomacy. By the time the United States was attempting to disengage from the war in Vietnam, however, the idea of atomic diplomacy had lost credibility. Now, infrastructure diplomacy. The concept of infrastructure diplomacy lies beyond the boundaries of just infrastructure financing to the planning, construction, and operation of the project itself. And this bilateral agreements and cross-border cooperation among companies. Now, shuttle diplomacy. Shuttle diplomacy is the action of an outside party in serving as an intermediary between or among principals in a dispute without direct principal to principal contact. And there is example of this. An early form of shuttle diplomacy emerged at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, When Italy briefly withdrew from the conference in protest of the other international delegations' refusal to grant its irredentist territorial claims promised by the Treaty of London. And here is an other example of this. Uh, that's shuttle diplomacy that Camp David negotiations between Israel and Egypt, mediated by United States. And there is one simple example of this, that Pakistan between China and USA, and Pakistan between Iran and Saudis. Now, ping pong diplomacy. Ping pong is basically a game which is commonly known as table tennis. Ping pong diplomacy refers to the exchange of table tennis players between the United States and People's Republic of China in the early 1970s. And ping pong diplomacy refers to the exchange of table tennis players between the United States and People's Republic of China in the early 1970s. So it is a definition of ping pong diplomacy, and actually it began during the 1971 uh, and World Table Tennis Championships in Nagoya. So this diplomacy allowed United States and China to people a way for talks on more serious issues. It allowed the United States and China to negotiate at sporting events. This ping pong diplomacy was successful and resulted in opening the US PRC relationship, leading the US to lift the embargo against China on June 10, 1971. On Feb 28, 1972, during President Nixon and Henry Kissinger's visit to Shanghai. The Shanghai Communique was issued between the US and the PRC. Now, niche diplomacy. Niche diplomacy mainly because middle powers have to follow limited foreign policy objectives as a result of their power capabilities, which are lower than those of great powers or superpowers. And niche diplomacy, although so often associated with very small countries, and has in fact been more fully developed by countries that have sufficient size and capacity to play notable roles on the international stage, but that are not strong enough to impose their positions or solutions. They can sometimes exercise persuasive influence, but rarely deciding force, even if not considered middle powers in terms of military or other basic strength or in terms of international rank. They can sometimes play significant roles as mediators, as key providers of assistance, or in other precise ways. Very large powers, too, it should be noted, may develop niche diplomatic and other particular capabilities. The difference is that great powers, unlike small or middle sized countries, lack either the necessity or the incentive to do so. They can usually exert influence as well as exercise power across the board. Sometimes, however, even they fail and have to deter to others with less strength but perhaps even more favorable advantages. Now, importance of diplomacy. So these are the some points that are very important. Like diplomacy provides an opportunity for countries to pursue mutual interest. It also enables them to cooperate with one another to solve common problems. It also helps countries to resolve conflicts, differences, and disagreements peacefully. Diplomacy also allows countries to help one another in times of needs. Basically, the purpose of diplomacy is to strengthen the state, nation, or organizations it serves in relations to others by advancing the interests in its change. To this end, diplomatic activity endeavors to maximize a group's advantages without the risk and expense of using force, and preferable without causing resentment. Thank you so much.